At the beginning of World War II, Germany was poised to crush Great Britain. Outgunned and outmanned, the British faced certain defeat. Like David facing Goliath, the British used stealth and cunning to match the Axis powers. Between 1940 and 1945, a small but elite organization worked from these offices at 54 Broadway in London. The organization was MI6, or Military Intelligence Section 6, the Foreign Office to the Crown. In the first few months of the war, MI6 was virtually all that stood between Great Britain and total annihilation.
All was going to be lost, or the British were going to have to cut a deal. Picture the situation in June of 1940. Russia was still an ally of Germany, so resources could flow through and from Russia into Germany. France was out of the war. Spain was a fascist country. Hitler had helped Franco win the Civil War. Without the United States, they're in a very dire situation. Dire, you just cannot win.
MI6 was joined by a web of secret agencies with names like Special Operations Executive, JEDBRA, and British Security Coordination. They would sabotage and intimidate their enemies, then manipulate their allies, all as part of a secret war for survival. Even the President of the United States was fooled by the spy tactics of the British Secret Service. For an organization Britain depended on for its very survival in war, MI6 had come a long way since the English identified a need for a formal intelligence gathering service in 1909.
There was a very wide-ranging review into the failure of British intelligence, and it turned out that part of the reason for the failure of British intelligence was that there was no such secret service. Everybody believed there was a secret service, but actually none existed.
Military intelligence was needed to protect the interests of the empire. The Ministry of Information was charged with the task of creating such a secret service. Mansfield Smith Cumming was the first head of MI6. His colorful personality provided the agency with traditions that exist to this day.
In honor of Cumming, the head of the British Secret Service has been known as C and not M, as in the James Bond novels. And Cumming wrote with green ink, and ever since then, the only person in Whitehall allowed to write in green ink is the Chief of the Secret Service.
Between 1909 and 1915, Mansfield Cumming built MI6 into a top-notch spy organization. During World War I, the agency gathered secret information about enemy movements in Europe.
The Secret Intelligence Service's greatest success was an organization called White Lady, a group of people who monitored train movements. And very straightforwardly, if you can monitor and analyze the frequency and the passengers and the cargoes on train journeys, then you can certainly get a glimpse into an enemy order of battle, into their deployments, and into individual units.
After World War I, MI6 gathered information discreetly by placing many of its agents in English passport offices throughout Europe. But this arrangement, perfect in peacetime, was disastrous when Hitler began his march west.
When the Nazis rolled through Belgium, Holland, Denmark, Norway, the passport control offices in those places, of course, had to be evacuated. So that left the Secret Intelligence Service largely devoid of any kind of useful source from within the Reich.
To make matters worse, MI6 kept such a low profile between wars that few in high office knew how effective and helpful the agency could be in a time of crisis. Had leaders like Neville Chamberlain known more about MI6 as World War II began, they might have known about Hitler's true intentions much earlier.
Political ignorance about the Secret Intelligence Service is hard to exaggerate. In 1940, the Prime Minister actually employed the Lord Privy Seal to undertake a study of MI5 and SIS in order to be able to understand how large these organizations were, what their role and functions were.
To fight a major world war, the British Secret Service would need to be improved and expanded. That job fell to Stuart Mingus.
In November 1939, Stuart Mingus took over an organization that was essentially bankrupt of talent, was essentially bankrupt of assets, and very shortly was going to be bankrupt of establishments that it could operate from on the continent.
Mingus was a quiet, taciturn man whose aristocratic pleasures provided both contacts and cover for his highly secretive life.
Stuart Mingus was regarded by his subordinates as aloof and diffident, certainly somebody to be feared. But amongst his contemporaries and his club friends, very few of whom were fully aware of his role as Chief of the Secret Intelligence Service, he was simply regarded as another gentleman who lived a gentleman's life, hunting at the weekends and living with his succession of wives and mistresses.
Mingus inherited an organization unprepared for the rigors of war. Those who knew about the secret agency considered it ineffective at best, incompetent at worst. But MI6 had a secret weapon that showed great promise, a weapon that could prove as devastating and as powerful as all the guns in Europe. During World War I, MI6 had purchased an old Bletchley Park mansion 70 kilometers outside of London. By the late 1930s, Bletchley Park housed a sharp team of brilliant scholars, linguists, and mathematicians working in absolute secrecy to break Germany's top-secret military and political communications codes. But code-breaking alone would not be enough to win the war. When Winston Churchill became Prime Minister in May of 1940, Britain's secret war took an even higher priority. Soon, MI6 and its codebreakers would be joined by an elite force designed to take the battle behind the front lines and into the heart of enemy territory. For Britain, June 1940 was perhaps the darkest time of the war. As the Luftwaffe unleashed a torrent of bombs on British civilians, Hitler was planning for an imminent army invasion. Bombs blighted the London landscape as the country struggled for its very survival. Winston Churchill was the man the nation turned to during the crisis. Churchill knew that MI6's code-breaking operation could be a decisive weapon in waging what he called total war.
I think that what Churchill meant by total war was not just sticking to a static front. This was a war that would be conducted on many fronts, not the least of which would be the civilian front. So it was taking the war beyond the front line and into the rear echelons, into the communications lines, into the local population. That was virtually unheard of during the First World War.
Churchill understood that war against a superior adversary required more than just information gathering and decryption. A secret army was needed, one that not only recruited the best British strategists, spies, and saboteurs, but foreign nationals as well. Britain was about to create the most secret organization the world had ever seen, the Special Operations Executive, or SOE.
You may blow up the odd factory, you may derail the odd train, but unless you can plug in to the indigenous resistance, unless you can find men and women who are going to actually want to do something about the state of their own country, form networks of agents, networks of saboteurs, that is the essential thing.
In July 1940, the SOE recruited refugees coming into London from occupied European countries. First, they were interviewed. Then they were given a warning about the dangers they would face.
He would say, look, you volunteer to go back, but you realize if you're doing that, you're putting your life on the line. I'm putting your life on the line. You sure you want to go on with it? At which point, most of them said, of course they wanted to go on with it.
Once selected, SOE recruits went through extensive, exhaustive training to wage secret war and inflict maximum damage on the enemy. They learned about explosives, communications, and propaganda. Once the classroom training was finished, recruits were sent off to a remote section of Scotland.
People had about 3 weeks severe training in mountain climbing, in living off the land, in handling small arms, in handling small boats, how to get into and out of a boat without making noise. Important, useful gift in the clandestine world.
In Scotland, the recruits trained in conditions similar to their home countries.
Well, when you came up to Scotland, you came to a countryside which was more like Norway, and you felt you trained the right muscles, and you felt very much at home. If you were doing long hikes up in Scotland, you came past remote farms, and the owner would be just as annoyed as a Norwegian mountain farmer would be if you passed without saying hello and having a chat and probably a cup of tea and that sort of thing. So you felt very much at home indeed.
SOE recruits had to face the difficult prospect that they might have to use their training in lethal force in combat.
It was very brutal. Just a couple of months before you were very peaceful young chaps back in Alderson, and now you have been taught how to use a fighting knife, knowing where to stick it into a body. Sometimes you had difficulties in falling asleep at night because you were thinking what you had been taught during the day.
SOE's early missions in the war were often plagued by failure. They lacked transportation to return to the continent and were not given enough supplies.
No shortage of volunteers, huge shortage of communications equipment, and huge shortage of the means of getting the agents back into occupied Europe. That meant either aircraft or ships. Royal Navy not prepared to take the risk.
By the end of 1941, the Royal Air Force finally began flying SOE operatives to Europe at night in what became known as Midnight Sonata missions. While SOE struggled to train recruits and get them into the field, the codebreakers at Bletchley Park had finally succeeded in deciphering some key German codes. To conceal the fact that a German code had been broken, Menges told no one, attributing the new intelligence to a fictional spy named Boniface instead.
And so they invented a spy, a well-placed spy in Germany, and his code name was Boniface. And so when the distribution took place, it was circulated, codename Boniface. The implication was this was an excellent source, but of course, because SIS had such a poor reputation for cultivating and recruiting good human assets in Germany, the military commanders took no notice of Boniface.
By November 1941, Boniface had been scrapped, and the highest British commanders were informed of MI6's breakthrough. Menges had quickly turned the moribund agency around. The product of its labors, dubbed Ultra by Churchill for its ultra-secret content, was proving to be an instrumental secret tool of war. Britain's clandestine war now had two components. MI6 would intercept and decode German military communications, and SOE would fight behind enemy lines to organize and arm a secret army of resistance fighters in Europe. The two agencies had the same mission, but often struggled with conflicting agenda.
There are two fundamental differences between MI6 and SOE. MI6's primary aim was to obtain intelligence from whatever sources it could, but certainly part of this was sending agents into enemy territory to obtain whatever secrets they could locate. On the other hand, SOE was to provide explosives, weapons, to attack communications, to blow up trains, even if needs be to assassinate people. The one, intelligence gathering requires silence, quietness, don't make a fuss, remain undercover, whereas SOE was to make loud bangs, to create a nuisance, to attack the Germans.
As MI6 was struggling to rebuild its reputation and SOE was training its operatives, the British were fighting yet another secret war. It was an extraordinary campaign of dirty tricks, salacious deeds, and exotic setups, and it was being fought not against an enemy, but against a potential ally. While MI6 and SOE were combating the Germans, another secret British organization, the British Security Coordination, or BSC, was fighting a different enemy, the enemy of American indifference.
The problem is that the Americans don't believe that World War II has anything to do with them. A lot of Americans are sympathetic towards the British, but they just don't see World War II as being their war. There's a tremendous feeling of complacency, a feeling that Britain will make it through, that the Americans really don't need to do anything.
The Americans, determined to never again be pulled into the horrors of another world war, passed strict neutrality laws in the late 1930s. These laws forbade intervention in foreign conflicts and thus presented serious problems for Great Britain.
It was very apparent to the British that they simply did not have the power to beat the Germans. Only if the United States could be involved in the war could Britain have a chance of winning a protracted war with the Germans.
Something had to be done to influence American public opinion. Britain waged a bloodless war against American apathy and used secret means to do it.
People imagine that the best secret weapons are weapons that are used in secret. But there is a weapon that is used in public that can be even more devastating, and that weapon is propaganda. Propaganda is planned in secret, but is used in public. And propaganda changes the way that people think, changes the way that history unfolds.
At Rockefeller Center in Manhattan, the British Security Coordination opened up offices in 1940, ostensibly to provide information about the war effort. In reality, the BSC was part of MI6. William Stevenson was a well-connected, wealthy Canadian businessman and a former war hero. He was recruited to run the British campaign in America.
Stevenson is a tough, ruthless businessman, had been a champion boxer, flyweight apparently at one time, a very tough, hard individual. He once volunteered to kill Hitler with a high-powered hunting rifle. So this is a tough, focused individual who wants to succeed and will do whatever it takes to win.
William Stevenson waged an all-out war on American isolationists, recruiting agents willing to use any means necessary, including sex, blackmail, forgery, deceit, and, if necessary, murder.
In order to be an agent for Stevenson, you had to be intelligent, ruthless. You know, one of the recruiting things was, I cannot tell you what sort of work you might be involved in, but if you join us, you mustn't be afraid of forgery, and you mustn't be afraid of murder.
Meeting at popular watering holes like the Stork Club in Manhattan, Stevenson, the businessman and socialite, used his extensive network of political, social, and business contacts to create an organization unparalleled in its effectiveness. Some U.S. businessmen saw the war as a financial and political opportunity and helped Stevenson in his efforts to convince Americans to give aid to the British.
The Rockefellers gave BSC a floor, 2 floors of space, basically rent-free, and also supplied free space for a whole myriad of other fronts that BSC was running.
The privileged access didn't stop with America's pro-war financial elite. Stevenson had friends in even higher places.
The White House was very cooperative. Without White House cooperation, there is no way that Stevenson's organization could have operated in the United States. It was operating beyond the law, sometimes in direct contradiction to U.S. law. So without the backing of the White House, J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI would simply have not allowed an organization like this to operate in the United States.
Just how far did the BSC go? In 1998, declassified files showed how nasty things could get if you were on Stevenson's hit list. The files tell the story of what the BSC did to Arthur Vandenberg. Vandenberg was a senator from Michigan and a prominent isolationist. He was also on the Appropriations Committee, a key position in 1941. In that year, Congress was about to vote on Lend-Lease, the controversial program to circumvent U.S. neutrality laws and provide arms and ammunition to Britain. The proposed Lend-Lease legislation was critical to Britain, and the BSC pulled out all the stops to influence Vandenberg's vote.
British intelligence took advantage of Senator Arthur Vandenberg's weakness for exotic women by sending over Cynthia, one of their most famous women spies, whose specialty was jumping in bed with men, changing their minds, stealing their codes, whatever else had to be done.
After Cynthia had finished with him, Vandenberg's position on European affairs had changed dramatically.
She shows up and changes Vandenberg's mind, or at least neutralizes him, on Lend-Lease in early 1941.
Whether Vandenberg's vote was changed because of Cynthia and the BSC will never be known.
Vandenberg was a very prominent isolationist. Sometime in the 1940s, he just suddenly turned around one day and became a prominent internationalist. No one ever asked who was beside him the morning he turned around.
The BSC's attempt to influence American politics didn't stop in the U.S. Senate. In 1941, the BSC targeted the most powerful political figure in America, the President of the United States.
One of the greatest of MI6's achievements before the United States comes into the war on the 7th of December 1941 was, alas, to deceive the Americans, and in particular to deceive President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Sir William Stevenson, Little Bill Stevenson as he was called, forged or had forged a whole series of documents which suggested that the Nazis had designs on Latin America.
The forgery department of MI6 created a map of Latin America and passed it to President Roosevelt.
This map is leaked to the head of the organization that became the OSS, William Donovan, and passed to the president.
With the map in hand, Roosevelt made an astounding speech on the radio.
I have in my possession a secret map made in Germany by Hitler's government, by the planners of the New World Order.
He goes on to explain that this map shows Nazi plans for the conquest of Latin America.
They have divided South America into 5 vassal states, bringing the whole continent under their domination.
If America was stunned, the Nazis were baffled. But in the end, no one was more surprised and angered than Roosevelt himself.
What we have recently discovered is that Roosevelt discovered in February 1942 that he had been fooled, and his immediate reaction was to demand that Little Bill Stevenson be sent home. But then, his advisors had second thoughts. Hold on a moment. We are now at war with Germany. It would be pretty embarrassing, wouldn't it, to admit that that great anti-German speech that you made on the 27th of October 1941 was based on a British forgery.
Not all of the British propaganda documents were forgeries. In February 1941, PM, the liberal evening newspaper in New York, ran a photo story that documented startling German atrocities. They were provided courtesy of the BSC.
These photos are very, very dramatic. One photo shows young men being marched through the streets, presumably off to be shot. There are shots of people being tied to stakes, about to be executed. There are shots of people apparently with Hasidic beards digging their own graves. Very disturbing photographs. How did these photographs come to find their way into the American press? They came indirectly through British intelligence. The cover story in the newspaper says a German flyer liked these photos so well that he took them with him on an air raid over Britain but was shot down. Now that is a propaganda cover story. It's a nice story because it kind of turns the knife in the wound. It says these are both horrible pictures and there was a German pilot who got off on this stuff and liked to carry it around with him. But the real story is that British security coordination passed them in a brown envelope to an official at the British Press Services. The British Press Services delivers the pictures to PM Magazine, and PM Magazine give the pictures to the American people.
The photos hit home in a way that words never could. While the British influenced American publications, German propaganda took a more direct approach.
The Germans used propaganda rather like an artillery barrage. The Germans began sending films to Latin America to show how potent the Nazi war machine is, to show how powerful Germany is. These films were beautifully made, but are alarming to watch.
The films found a very different audience than the German filmmakers had intended.
British censorship in Bermuda, a secret operation, would intercept German films. They would copy these propaganda films and send them off to filmmakers in the United States.
The re-edited movies became an effective tool for anti-German propaganda. Some of these films were simply given different narration.
Guard particularly against this group. These are the most dangerous. German youth. Children when the Nazi Party came into power. They know no other system than the one that poisoned their minds. They're soaked in it. Trained to win by cheating. Trained to pick on the weak. They've heard no free speech. Read no free press. They were brought up on straight propaganda.
In addition to changing the narration, footage from the intercepted films was added to Allied propaganda films to enhance their shocking effect.
And the tender, repentant, sorry German people carried the torch of their culture to Austria, Czechoslovakia, Poland, France, England, Norway, Holland, Denmark, Belgium, Luxembourg, Russia, Yugoslavia, Greece, and the United States of America.
From 1940 to 1945, propaganda films were an important weapon in Britain's secret war. Another method for influencing Americans was to manipulate the new bellwether of public opinion, the public opinion poll. These polls were supposed to measure accurately what America thought. But BSE had operatives working inside the polling companies to influence or change the results.
A typical tactic was to do polls, rigged polls, at the conventions of national organizations, the American Legion, the CIO. You do a rigged poll and then show that 70–80% of the rank and file was pro-British and wanted to help the British.
In the first 18 months of the war, the BSC manipulated politicians, rigged opinion polls, and planted stories in major U.S. newspapers. It was an extremely effective campaign. But it was the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor that finally brought America into the war. Now the BSC's challenge was to ensure that Europe, not Japan, was America's top priority and that her resolve didn't weaken in the difficult days ahead. The bombing of Pearl Harbor in December 1941 brought America into the war as Britain's ally. It also caused the BSC, led by William Stephenson, to shift its focus. It worked hard to influence Americans to ensure that defeating Germany was their top priority. But the black propaganda of the British secret war wasn't reserved only for Americans. It was also directed at the hearts and minds of the German people.
What the British would do was find out the names of Germans who had been killed in fighting and the addresses, and then write to them saying, "Dear Frau so-and-so, I am a friend of your husband or your son. He is not dead, but rather he has deserted and is now living free in Canada. He wants you to know that Hitler is going to lose the war, and because of this, he's sending you a food hamper." And a food hamper would arrive at the home, allegedly from sons who had not been killed in combat.
Some of the dirty tricks held the possibility of rather humorous consequences.
British intelligence was reading the mail that was sent from Germany to Latin America. They had a secret way of opening envelopes. And one of the things that a British censor allegedly did during the war was this. He realized that there was a German official in Latin America who was corresponding with two women in Berlin. One was his wife, one was his mistress. As a prank, he returned the mistress's letter into the wife's envelope and the wife's letter to the mistress's envelope. We don't know what happened thereafter.
While the BSC fought a war of words in America and Germany, in Britain, Special Operations Executive, or SOE, had been training and preparing for missions into the heart of enemy territory. In the first year of its existence, SOE grew into an elite fighting force of well-trained experts. By 1942, it was ready to launch one of the most daring missions of the war. The target was a power plant in Vemork, Norway. Early in the war, Allied leaders had learned of the Germans' production of so-called heavy water, a key component for the production of an atomic bomb. Many of the scientists who fled Germany years before believed their countrymen were closer than any other nation to building an atomic bomb.
Churchill and Roosevelt met in America and discussed the problem and decided that we have to do something with it. We have to stop the Germans producing it. And the only way of doing it was sabotage. They decided that you can't bomb it because you will get so many civilian casualties, because this is a very, very narrow valley.
The first mission, Operation Freshman, was launched on October 18, 1942. Two gliders containing 40 well-armed and trained paratroopers were towed behind two bombers across the English Channel.
Of the 4 aircraft, only one returned. One of the tugs got back, but the other tug and both gliders crashed, killing most of the people on board. And those who weren't killed in the crash were massacred shortly thereafter by the Gestapo.
Giving up was not an option. A new plan was designed, this one using SOE officers from Norway. Joachim Ronberg was a young Norwegian considered by his British superiors to be bright, resourceful, and brave. Ronberg was brought to London and asked to lead a team back to Norway for a second attempt to destroy the plant. Ronberg learned not only why the mission was top secret, but also of the danger he and his team would face.
Well, when I came down to London, I was told that the Germans knew the target and they were building up the defenses there.
The first attempt had relied upon force to achieve the objective. This time, the Vemork plant would be taken with stealth. To attack the heavily fortified plant, Ronberg chose a small team of 6 Norwegian operatives. First, they would have to find a way into the plant. The building sat on top of a hill. A bridge across a deep gorge offered the only access. German and Norwegian guards were almost always on duty, though there were fewer guards at night. The team waited until dark, when most of the Germans were asleep. They descended the gorge and climbed up the ice-covered wall on the other side. Once inside the building, half the team covered the sleeping Germans while Ronberg snuck further into the facility.
We saw through a window that there was one Norwegian guard in the room, and we took him by surprise. And he was standing with hands in the air.
With the guards inside the plant subdued, Ronberg proceeded to set his plastic explosives. As he and his men worked, they received an unusual request.
When we were doing this Norwegian guardman, workman, suddenly broke in and said that he couldn't do anything preventing us blowing up the factory, but could he have his glasses, because it was so difficult to get glasses in Norway these days. And you would think in such a situation that you would answer, damn your glasses, but instead you dropped what you were doing, you were looking around the room and you found the box for the glasses and gave them to him, and he said, thank you very much.
Ronberg and his men made their way out of the plant as the explosion ripped through the darkness. The guards' compound was far enough away that they didn't hear the explosion at first, and the men were able to get back across the gorge. The next morning, the Germans launched a manhunt. Ronberg and his men escaped from Vemork, but the most difficult part of their journey lay ahead. Since no planes could land and pick them up, Ronberg and his team had to ski for 18 days to the safety of neutral Sweden.
We saw quite a lot of people on the way, but we suspected people seeing soldiers in Norway in uniform and with weapons on their rucksacks to be Germans and not Norwegians. And that was true enough. We met people and they certainly believed us to be Germans. When we got to this hospital, we were asked to take off all our clothes and put them in a bunch. And so we were invited into a shower, and there you had 2 very nice Swedish nurses with a bucket of soap and a brush, and started brushing from there and downwards. And it was quite a reception, I must say.
This act of sabotage by Ronberg and his team, orchestrated by British intelligence, denied the Third Reich a key ingredient for its atomic program. Had Germany been the first nation to develop the atom bomb, the war most certainly would have ended differently. By 1943, SOE had evolved into the elite fighting force its founders had envisioned. SOE operatives had successfully parachuted into France and other occupied countries, set up supply drops, and recruited resistance fighters. They'd become adept at blowing up bridges, stopping trains, disrupting supply lines, and destroying communications equipment. But for all the success of Britain's secret war, the most important goal still remained: retaking the European continent. From the beginning of the war, Britain had been planning for the day of the invasion, and secret organizations were a big part of that plan. SOE, BSC, and MI6 would all play important roles. Another organization was created specifically for D-Day. It was called the Jedbras. The Jedbras was the code name for a secret organization of trained commandos. They began training almost 2 years before D-Day. SOE got the word out that volunteers were needed. Potential recruits weren't told what the assignment would be, only that it was top secret and highly dangerous.
I've been in 3 years. I hadn't seen a German other than a prisoner of war. I hadn't heard a shot fired in anger. And one day on the squadron notice board appeared a notice to the effect that volunteers were sought who were prepared to undergo parachute training and the like. Well, this sounded a bit exciting. You didn't need to be Einstein anyway to work out this was going to be a job somewhere in Europe.
The job was one of the most extraordinary of the war. Secret teams of 3 men, one from France, one from England, and one from America, would be dropped behind enemy lines to pour fuel on the burning embers of discontent.
It was thought each would take with them arms for perhaps about 200 men. And they would form a nucleus which would liaise with the advancing armies, would take care of specific targets and would provide intelligence.
For 18 months, the Jedbras trained. They would quietly arrive in Europe as the first wave of the largest invasion in the history of war. They had extensive training in munitions, hand-to-hand combat, communications, and search and destroy missions. By May 1944, they were ready for D-Day. In the spring of 1944, a secret team of elite commandos known as the Jedbras was about to be dropped behind enemy lines. They would be the first wave of soldiers in the D-Day invasion.
We were the first real paramilitary force, the first of the special forces. The Americans have since modeled their green berets on us. We were the pioneers of special forces.
It was one of the most dangerous jobs of the war.
They were aware that they would most likely face hostile interrogation and probable execution if caught. And they were all given the option of taking into the field an L pill, a lethal pill, which would enable them to commit suicide.
The teams parachuted into enemy territory 3 days before the actual invasion. Once on the ground, they went about the task of establishing contact with the Allies and avoiding contact with the enemy.
If you were captured, you were to say that you were a member of the Allied armed forces. Some were captured and were shot. Some were imprisoned and died in prison. But the line was that you were an Allied soldier and the Geneva Convention would look after you, you hoped.
In the event something went wrong, the radio operators were trained to use secret communications to warn their commanders back home that they had been captured.
If you were caught, or if you were being forced to send under duress, first you had a certain sequence of letters that you always had to put on the start of your message. If you missed them out, people knew there was something wrong. That type of thing. If somebody's holding a pistol to your head, you can let people know that you are sending under duress.
But the Jedbra teams weren't always successful in avoiding danger. A few weeks after the D-Day invasion, Sergeant Ron Brierly and his Jedbra team were on a mission when they ran into the enemy.
And we literally ran into a German heavy machine gun that raked all three vehicles. He was a good shot. And so Bennett was hit, and de Schoenen was hit, and 2 others were hit. Fortunately, nobody was killed. We got them out of the vehicles, and we got in the ditch by the side of the road. And somebody gave Albert de Schoenen, my French officer, a cigarette, and he inhaled through the cigarette, and the smoke came puffing out of his chest. It was quite dramatic.
The Jedbras proved instrumental in making D-Day a success. They disrupted the enemy and provided important information to the Allies. The Jedbras were only one part of the secret force that the Allies depended on to make the invasion successful. MI6 was also implementing its covert plans to keep the enemy off guard on the big day. In fact, one of MI6's double agents would play a vital role in deceiving the Germans. The man's name was Juan Garcia, but he would go down in history as the famous double agent Garbo. Early in the war, the agency, criticized for its inability to keep and recruit good agents, almost let its best agent get away.
He then went to the Germans, volunteered to spy for the Nazis, and claimed that he would be able to get to Britain. He only got as far as Lisbon, and he started supplying information to the Germans, which they accepted. And when we finally realized that this agent was reporting on information claiming that it had come from Britain, that we then brought him to Britain and adopted him as a double agent, and he became easily the most successful double agent of the Second World War.
To keep the Germans guessing about the exact location of the invasion, MI6 had Garbo provide misleading information over his wireless set. In the months preceding D-Day, MI6 had taken great pains to build Garbo's credibility with the Germans. He was given enough information to maintain his plausibility, but never enough to damage the agency or endanger lives. It was a risky game, but German officials trusted Garbo's information completely. This credibility was crucial during D-Day. The Allies fooled the Germans into believing that the invasion was coming further north and south than it really was. By 1945, the British Secret Service had grown into a vast organizational network, a well-run, well-honed collection of agencies devoted to planting the seeds of enemy destruction. But for all its successes, MI6 and SIS had also fallen prey to one of the oldest ploys of the spy profession, the double agent.
Late in 1944 and right the way through to the end of 1945, the Secret Intelligence Service was engaged in post-war planning, preparing for its role in the post-war era. There's a great deal of very detailed discussion about how and where SIS should be deployed. None of this, of course, was of any remote use, because the person sitting quietly, acting as secretary at some of these meetings, was Kim Philby, who supplied every document and every conclusion to his Soviet contacts.
Kim Philby had been recruited by the Soviets in the early 30s while attending Cambridge University. At the beginning of the war, he'd been recruited by MI6. At the end of the war, he was a rising star in the agency. Philby wasn't the only one. The Soviets had also successfully recruited others from Cambridge. It would take over 2 decades, but a shocked nation would learn one day of the group called the Cambridge Five and of the damage they had done to Britain's national security.
The Soviet Union has better intelligence on its allies than any power had ever had before. We now know that it had Kim Philby in MI6, that it had Anthony Blunt in MI5, that it had John Cairncross in the code-breaking center at Bletchley Park.
As the war drew to a close, it wasn't yet known how much damage had been done by the Soviets to MI6. The British Secret Service had carried the day during the war, but a crucial decision faced Great Britain: what to do with SOE at war's end.
The main issue in MI6 at the end of the war is whether SOE, its great wartime rival, SOE being concerned with sabotage and subversive warfare, MI6 being concerned with intelligence collection, whether these are going to continue into the Cold War as rival organizations. And the big decision made at the end of the war is that SOE is rolled up and its subversive warfare capacity is absorbed into MI6.
With the end of the SOE came the end of one of the greatest and most impressive covert organizations in the history of warfare. And for those who fought Britain's secret war, the lessons are just as important today as they were on the battlefields and behind enemy lines in the 1940s.
Freedom and peace is not obvious. You have to fight for it. You have to fight for it every day, more or less.
The British have always been good at gathering intelligence and keeping their secrets. British secret services like MI6 and SOE used extreme measures to triumph over fascism and secure the country's survival. The truth is slowly emerging about British intelligence operations during World War II. However, the exact extent of this intelligence gathering, its methodology, and its results will to a certain degree always remain one of the best-kept secrets of war.